The massive NATO assault was only partly a surprise. Some of Soviet frontal aviation's elite units had been too slow to move their aircraft and supporting infrastructure away from airfields close to what was now the forward edge of the battle area. Those aircraft and the bases themselves were now smoking ruins, blasted by waves of F-111s and tornadoes. But other squadrons had reacted faster. In hundreds of places across Eastern Europe, tiny detachments of 2 or 4 aircraft could be found incongruously deployed in the trees to the side of dirt roads. Instead of hangars and bunkers, their fuel and weapons were deployed alongside them in ubiquitous Ural trucks. Zooming into one of these locations, just 100 kilometers from the front line, we find a pair of the Soviet Union's latest 4th-generation fighters. In a matter of minutes, they will roll out of cover and rise to take part in an attack on the E-3 sentries that are pulling the strings for NATO's air armada. The 2 pilots stand just inside the tree line, smoking their cigarettes and exchanging a few grunted observations while the ground crew finish fueling and arming their aircraft. The chief gives the signal and they walk a few yards to the planes, climb the ladders and drop into their cockpits. Each aircraft has its own crew chief who helps the pilot situate himself in his seat, tighten his straps and double-check the oxygen line. Then he climbs back down the ladder and pulls it away. The lead pilot moves the engine ignition switch to start and then advances one throttle to idle. Needles rise on gauges as the turbine spins up on its internal starter. Fuel is injected and with a roar that is felt as much as heard, the big Klimov engine fires. RPM rises steadily. Exhaust gas temperature goes with it, then stabilizes in the green. Hydraulic pressure does the same, generator output likewise. He moves the second engine to start and follows the same process. His wingman is now ready as well. The leader salutes to the crew chief, releases the wheel brakes and taxis 10 meters from the clearing to the road. Turning right, he lines up, stands on the pneumatic brakes as he advances the throttles through into afterburner. Both engines roar. There's no tower to call for permission, so he releases the brakes and the MiG leaps forward, kicking up dust and stones. Other than a Harrier, no US or European aircraft could attempt this type of takeoff. Their delicate engines would suck in all kinds of objects and expire in a spray of exotic alloys. But the Fulcrum was built with just this kind of operation in mind. Its landing gear has plenty of travel, its intakes are carefully designed to deflect dirt and mud. The main intakes are closed for takeoff and the engine is breathing through alternate gills on the top of the wing roots. 1,000 feet or so down the road, the MiG rotates and lifts. As the nose gear comes up, the main intake doors open and the Fulcrum is ready for battle. The second aircraft follows. They stick to the nap of the Earth, heading towards the telltale radar emissions from the Sentry with small instructions now and again from GCI. The 2 pilots have to assume that their comrades are also airborne and headed in the same direction, or this will be a short and fiery flight. They needn't have worried. Minutes later, the crew of the AWACS they're targeting begins to pick up dozens of bogies closing on them. Hurriedly, they reverse course and vector as many fighters as they can muster to their defense. But the Soviet fighters are attacking from multiple angles. The 2 sides converge in pairs and fours. The MiG crews detect the telltale emissions of an F-15's powerful radar. Their mission is to keep the Eagles busy, while big Su-27s penetrate through the screen and attack the E-3s. As they detect the targeting radar, the MiG pilots stay close together and go to full afterburner while they rise to engage, activating their own radars and trying to find a shot with R-27s. But Sparrows are in the air first. The big red radar warning light blossoms and a buzzer sounds. The MiG leader breaks hard right, dumping chaff and flares from the fuselage ahead of the fin. A streak of light marks the spot where an AIM-7 loses track and explodes in a chaff cloud. His wingman isn't so lucky. His MiG is turned into a cloud of aluminium shards as 2 Sparrows detonate close by. The leader turns back, taking advantage of the falling debris and the chaff cloud to close in on the pair of Eagles. He remembers his centerline tank and punches it off. Whether it's this or the confusing radar plot that distracts the US pilots, he'll never know, but they don't spot him quickly enough to shoot him first. His infrared sensor picks up their track from 6 kilometers and he volleys a pair of R-73s at them head-on. Now the Eagles are defensive. They split. One of the Archers tracks the leader, but it detonates too far back for the small warhead to have any effect. The MiG pilot follows his enemy's turn. He has to be quick as the other Eagle will be back in a few seconds. The American knows what he's doing, trading height for speed as he tries to extend. But the Fulcrum is better suited for this situation. He's lighter, more agile, and he has a higher turn rate. Although Western pilots would see the Fulcrum as a crude aircraft, it does have some tricks. The Eagle is still nearly 50 degrees off the Fulcrum's nose. No problem. The pilot tracks it with the helmet-mounted sight, straining to keep his head steady against 8G. He gets a tone and squeezes twice, just as he senses the other F-15 coming back by the shifting image in the mirrors attached to the cockpit frame. This time an R-73 goes right up the tailpipe. No time to assess the kill though, or close him with his gun. He tightens his turn, pulling as many G as he can and punching out flares. A sidewinder coasts past as he dives for the ground, noticing the amber fuel warning light for the first time. 10 minutes later, he's lining up back on the dirt road. Although it has been costly, their mission has been a success. 2 sentries are down. The others have been pushed back a critical 100 extra kilometers. Now Frontal Aviation's fencers, fitters and frogfoots can go to work. When we think about the Cold War in the 1980s, we tend to imagine the scenario of a desperate Soviet Union lashing out to preserve its waning power. Curiously, the Soviets had the exact opposite view. They believed that the West would be the aggressor, and in general, they designed their military as an integrated force for a defensive war. As we'll get into, no weapon system was more representative of this strategy than the MiG-29 Fulcrum, development of which began in about 1969. Soviet tactical fighter development was offset from that of the US. The F-15 and F-14 were well into development even as the MiG-23 was being deployed as the Soviets' third-generation fighter. MiG, Sukhoi and Yakovlev hence began low-level work on the broad concepts that would become the Soviet Union's fourth-generation fighters only during the late 1960s. Eventually, in 1971, the Ministry of Defense issued a statement of requirements for what they termed the Advanced Tactical Fighter, abbreviated as PFI in Russian. This aircraft's principal role was interception, using medium-range missiles guided by a look-down radar and long-range infrared search and track system, with lethal abilities as a close-in fighter as a backup. This was in stark contrast to the MiG-23, which had essentially no capabilities within visual range. In support of its mission, the fighter was to have advanced active and passive countermeasures, high maneuverability, and a thrust-to-weight ratio higher than 1. It was to be able to take on and beat any Western air superiority fighter and intercept types like the F-111 and the forthcoming Tornado. Air-to-ground weapons delivery was very much a minor part of the aircraft's role. The Soviets had not yet become interested in a true multi-role aircraft and would arguably never produce one. Anticipating the formal specification, MiG had started more serious work on their designs in 1970. As was typical in the Soviet system, the Central Aerodynamics and Hydrodynamics Institute assisted with the general arrangement of the aircraft, while the State Research Institute of Aircraft Systems worked on the avionics setup, which would be exceptionally sophisticated relative to what had come before. MiG initially preferred a single-engined fighter, but this idea rapidly fell away, both due to issues that had been encountered with the MiG-23 in terms of reliability and the need for greater resistance to battle damage. A twin-engined arrangement with separate intakes therefore emerged early on in the process. The earliest configurations had shoulder-mounted wings that were trapezoidal in shape, a low-mounted tail and a single vertical fin. The wings had pronounced leading edge extensions and full-span slats on the leading edges. Intakes were large, steeply raked two-dimensional units with horizontal intake ramps. Already at this stage, the aircraft had 6 underwing hardpoints. At this point, MiG were undecided about the weight class that the advanced fighter would occupy. They therefore also developed a larger design that was quite reminiscent of the MiG-25, but with a single fin. This concept, fitted with twin tails, would end up becoming the heavier of MiG's 2 submissions to the competition. The third study led to the eventual MiG-29 and was the other submission. It was a less conventional idea in which the fuselage, wings and engine nacelles were blended into one shape. This moved the wings to a lower position and provided a convenient location for the internal gun within one of the wing root extensions. It was a lightweight fighter weighing less than 30,000 pounds, although it was smaller than the eventual aircraft and had a very small wing area, partially because of the lifting effect of the fuselage. The 1971 formalization of requirements separated the Advanced Tactical Fighter program into 2 parts. One was the original PFI, which was an interceptor and long-range escort fighter. The other was the Advanced Light Fighter, or PLMI, optimized for operations over friendly territory and the forward edge of the battle area. Conceptually, it was therefore much more like the MiG-21. PFI would ultimately become the Su-27, PLMI the MiG-29. Whereas PFI had the best of everything and a price tag to match, the light fighter was intended to be cheap to make and easy to operate by semi-skilled personnel from unprepared strips. It was to be effective in the hands of averagely skilled pilots. 70% of the fleet was to be PLMI and 30% would be PFI. MiG, Sukhoi and Yakovlev all intended to submit designs for both requirements. I've already described the MiG entry. Pavel Sukhoi was initially quite reluctant to participate in studies of fourth-generation tactical fighter concepts because he believed that Soviet electronics were currently too bulky and heavy to allow a realistic fighter to be developed. Nothing like giving up before you've started. He was, however, persuaded, in a Soviet sense, to take part in such developments and started to design an aircraft in February 1970. Presumably with the help of Tsagi, Sukhoi went straight to a lifting body with twin engines and twin tails. The engines were widely spaced in an F-14 style, and the general arrangement was based on the stillborn T-4S bomber project. Wings had an unusual ogival shape. Sometime in 1971, another internal team came up with a more conventional design that somewhat resembles a hybrid of F-15 and F-14. I assume by coincidence it looks a bit like North American Aviation's FX entry. It shared the ogival wing but obtained far less lift from the fuselage. Both of these designs, designated T-10-1 and T-10-2, were too large and complicated to be submitted for the PLMI requirement, though. Yakovlev's design was frankly ridiculous for a 1970s fighter competition. They had started developing the Yak-45 in the lead up to the competition and developed it into the Yak-45I. This featured large engine nacelles in a sharp package. Due to its obviously outdated aerodynamics, it was rejected. MiG's entry was thus selected for the light fighter, as it was the only option. Sukhoi's T-10-1 won the PFI competition and it would become the Su-27. Although the suppliers and overall concepts were now selected, there was a great deal of detailed work to do. It was nearly 18 months from the selection in early 1973 to the final design being locked down for final development in the middle of 1974. The big choices that still needed to be made were in the airframe configuration, the engines, and the avionics. Of these, the most controversial was the airframe. Despite the obvious benefits of having a single lifting body combining the fuselage with the wings and the horizontal tail, there remain plenty of influential traditionalists in Tsagi and at MiG itself. One angle of attack, as it were, was that the integrated layout gave a bigger surface area, but that in turn increased drag beyond that of a conventional aircraft of equivalent size. The other main criticism was that the integrated airframe would be less strong. As the debate raged, it became clear at MiG that the traditional design wouldn't deliver the required agility. In tight turns, the conventional layout with lateral intakes had quite poor performance because the intake on the leeward side of the turn would be masked, and whatever air it did get would be turbulent. Furthermore, the conventional design would be limited to angles of attack of about 20 degrees, which was clearly insufficient for an aircraft intended to take on US fourth generation fighters. Belienko, the chief designer at MiG, therefore quickly concluded that the integrated airframe was the best solution. Sagi were not convinced at all, though. Despite both Sukhoi and MiG coming to the same conclusion, they tried to insist on both OKBs developing their conventional aircraft. Rather than take them on in a direct conflict of wills or escalate to the Ministry of Defense, Belienko took an engineer's approach. His team methodically set out all the facts about the two options and in doing so gradually convinced the main Tsagi team to come round to MiG's way of thinking. The MiG-29 therefore has a smoothly blended profile with prominent lurkses for better lift at high angles of attack, which combine with automatic leading-edge flaps, trailing-edge flaps and flaperons to give a remarkable amount of lift. Stabilators deflect differentially for roll control, augmenting the ailerons and resulting in outstanding agility throughout the flight envelope. There is a small hydraulically actuated speed brake between the fins. Those vertical fins are canted slightly out and the stabilators droop slightly downwards. This combination makes the MiG-29 statically stable and thus meant fly-by-wire was unnecessary. Wing area was initially 366 square feet but was increased to 409 after experiments with scale models. Besides the aerodynamics, engines also proved challenging. All Soviet jet fighters thus far had been powered by turbojets, but the engine design bureaus and the Center for Engine Development at Siam were very aware of the potential of high-powered turbofans in fighter applications. MiG's choice of engines were developed by Lulka, Perm, which was now headed by Pavel Solovyov, and Klimov, which was led by Sergei Izotov. Of these, Lulka and Perm offered turbofans, with only Izotov at Klimov sticking to his guns on turbojets. Lulka and Perm therefore immediately proposed their AL-31F and D-30F6 engines respectively, but both of these engines were far too big for a light fighter. The AL-31F produced 27,500 pounds of force in full afterburner. The D-30 made a massive 34,170 pounds. The MiG-29 needed something with more like 18,000. Klimov therefore developed and proposed its first fighter turbofan in the form of the RD-33. It was around this time, in early 1973, that Tamansky entered the chat with their 16,300 pound force R-67-300. Tamansky regarded their engine's lower weight as a decisive advantage. Having assessed the two options, MiG chose the RD-33. This would prove to be a solid, reliable choice, although its relatively crude design led to it being rather smoky when out of afterburner and thus giving away the MiG's location prior to the merge. Although Soviet and Warsaw Pact pilots seemingly lived with this issue, their Indian counterparts developed a tactic in which they went into an intercept at a higher than normal speed and then cut the engines back to idle at about 25 kilometers, coasting towards their target and then going straight into afterburner for the final stage of the attack. Achieving the required rough strip performance meant some innovation in the intake configuration. To protect against foreign object damage, when the engines are started with pressure on the nose wheel, the main intakes are completely blocked off by perforated panels. The engine breathes through spring-loaded gills on top of the wing root extensions. When weight comes off the nose gear, the FOD protection doors swing back up into a horizontal position. As airspeed builds, airflow over the fuselage pushes these gills closed. If they didn't open for some reason, then they could be forced open via a control in the cockpit, but if this was done, then maximum speed was limited to 0.85 Mach. The gills are incidentally a good indicator of the MiG's energy state as it gets slow in a dogfight because they open as airflow decreases. As a fourth-generation fighter, the MiG-29 was intended to receive a very sophisticated avionics package, including a pulse Doppler radar capable of look-down, shoot-down engagements, an infrared search and track system, and a helmet-mounted sight. These were very expensive items in the Soviet Union, which only had a limited ability to produce semiconductors. There was therefore a time when two versions of the aircraft were in development, one with the full avionics package and the other with a version of that on the MiG-23. In early 1976, however, the Politburo itself decided that there was no point in a neutered version and that only full capability versions of the Fulcrum and Flanker would be developed. The MiG-29 would thus deploy with the SUV-29 or S-29 weapons control system and the S-31 optoelectronic targeting suite. The latter consisted of a head-up display, CRT cockpit display, and an inertial navigation system, as well as the Erst in its transparent ball ahead of the starboard leading edge of the canopy, and the helmet-mounted sight. The Fulcrum would be the first aircraft to deploy with this combination of fire control systems. Learning lessons from Vietnam and the Middle East, the MiG-29's pilot sat in a raised cockpit under a bubble canopy with a one-piece windscreen. His all-round visibility was aided by triple rear-view mirrors on the windscreen frame. Controls were designed to be simple to use, but with quite limited flexibility. It was not a hands-on throttle and stick layout. On the stick you have the triggers, the radar lock-on button, the acquisition cursor for selecting targets on the radar screen and the Erst, the brake lock button and the trim button. And then the controls for chaff and flares are on the throttle, which was mounted on the cockpit sidewall rather than the left console. Other controls were well arranged by Soviet standards and with practice could be found and manipulated without looking into the cockpit. Unlike in Western aircraft, some controls, like those for cabin temperature and exterior lights, are also mounted on the cockpit sidewall. The cockpit was designed for the average 1.75 meter tall Russian pilot. Taller pilots found it rather cramped. The K-36DM ejection seat was also very uncomfortable, which wasn't a problem with an average sub-1 hour mission, but was more problematic in longer ferry flights, long being 2.5 hours in this case. The result of all this development was that the definitive MiG-29 emerged from development with a radically different profile to the previous MiG-23, which hopefully is obvious in this schematic. Constructed with a variety of composites and aluminium-lithium alloys, empty weight was 21,300 pounds with normal takeoff weight a shade under 30,000. Massive engine power gave a greater than 1.2 thrust-to-weight ratio at takeoff. Combat range was intended to be 450 nautical miles, and the aircraft could ferry up to 1,500 at high altitude when carrying a 1,500-litre centerline fuel tank. Both of these ambitions would prove to be deeply optimistic. Because of the use of the large Lurxes for the rough field intakes, there was not much space in there for internal fuel. Only 4,300 litres were carried in 4 fuselage and 2 wing tanks, and the engines were gas guzzlers. A 1,520-litre centerline tank could, and usually was, carried. This was a somewhat unique tank as its size blocked the exhaust from the MiG's auxiliary power unit. MiG therefore inserted a vertical pipe that went straight through the tank and allowed the exhaust to flow out. Fuel economy was further compromised by a quite poor finish. Although it was built from advanced materials, the skin was essentially still made by Ivanov bashing a piece of sheet metal with a ball-peen hammer. His comrades then riveted the skin on. Seeing a MiG-29 up close reveals rippling skin and rivets that are far from flush. When questioned about this decades later, the MiG's lead designer, Belienko, shrugged. The finish was good enough, and in any case it disrupted airflow and improved maneuverability. All in all, it was still a formidable package, although even at this stage of development the extreme lack of mission flexibility was apparent. The MiG-29 had very limited range and effectively no multi-role capability whatsoever. MiG regarded the latter as a fundamental issue, but it was far too wise to bring it up. And besides, the aircraft was now ready for flight. In 1977, the first MiG-29 prototype rolled out of the factory. For the first time in a Soviet fighter, the ministry had specified a service life limit. For this reason, the design team had made the aircraft stronger than usual, with the result that even extensive use of composites could not get the weight down to the design spec. When the prototype lifted off for the first time on October the 6th, 1977, it weighed 1,500 pounds too much. Even so, this aircraft was highly successful. It was joined by a second aircraft in June 1978. This aircraft had a short life, crashing on its ninth flight when one of its engines suffered an uncontained compressor failure and the fragments severed control cables. A third aircraft joined it in April, then a fourth in June 1979 and a fifth in November 1979. This was more production representative as it had integral wing tanks. It would make 229 flights before it was unceremoniously destroyed in tests to understand the aircraft's resistance to battle damage. Fire control was integrated into the seventh development aircraft, which scored the type's first kill in testing when it downed a drone with an infrared K-27R. This aircraft served as a test article for the MiG-29K carrier fighter when it was modified with an arrestor hook. Various other systems were added as more aircraft were built, finishing with the 14th and final development bird, which featured all of the production systems in one package. It made its first flight on December the 30th, 1982. It did, however, still have ventral fins outboard of the engine nacelles, which were needed to improve directional stability at high alpha and to assist in spin recovery. These would be removed from the 71st production model onwards because of modifications made to the flight control system. One late change to the design was the addition of flare dispensers, based on operational experience in Afghanistan, where Mujahideen fighters had employed Red Eye and Stinger manpads against low-flying Soviet tactical jets. The sixth prototype was the first to incorporate these, initially on the wings just ahead of the fins. Later prototypes moved the dispensers to dorsal strakes before the designers finally settled on dispensers flush with the rear fuselage. The chaff and flare dispensers are somewhat different than those on Western aircraft. On these types, the countermeasures are dispensed backwards into the airflow. The Soviet system has them firing forwards and upwards so that they initially appear closer to the launching aircraft and are thus more likely to appear to the seeker that they represent the target aircraft. The specific system was the BVP-30-26M, which fired a 26mm flare or chaff cartridge. Each of the two launchers had 30-round capacity. When the Soviet flares were tested after the fall of communism, it was found that they were largely ineffective against the latest models of Sidewinder. They were, however, perfectly tuned for the seeker heads of the R-60 and the R-73. The West first got wind of the MiG-29 in spring of 1979 when a satellite passed over Zhukovsky at an opportune moment and captured a grainy image of one of the prototypes. The aircraft's exact configuration and capabilities remained shrouded in mystery for a decade. Thanks to the fall of communism and the resultant fact that many Fulcrums ended up in NATO service, we now have a complete picture of the aircraft's capabilities, and thus the threat it would have presented over the 1980s battlefield. After the start of production in the early 80s, the Soviet Union would produce two main single-seat variants of the type, albeit with some variants within that run to provide downgraded versions for export. There was also the MiG-29UB two-seat trainer, which in a break in tradition I'll actually talk about here. I'm not going to cover the seemingly endless series of overhyped upgrades that were sold and promised after 1991, though. The single-seaters break down into those with the original upper fuselage contour and those with the humped back to incorporate another 600 litres of fuel. The initial MiG-29 was known as Fulcrum A by NATO. The first 70 examples retained the ventral fins used to improve stability. From aircraft 71 onwards, the flight control computer was upgraded and the ventral fins were deleted to reduce complexity and weight. Most of the composite structures were also replaced by alloy as the composites proved insufficiently durable in operations. Structure aside, Fulcrum A established the weapons and avionics setup that would stay with the Fulcrum during the Cold War into the 1990s. Avionics were top draw for the time. The system was developed by Phasertron based on their previous work on the experimental Soyuz radar. The MiG-29 was originally intended to have a planar array antenna and a digital signal processing system similar to the MiG-31, with a range of at least 100 kilometers against a fighter target. This proved to be unachievable given the size of the MiG-29's nose and the commitment to low weight, though. Phasertron therefore reverted to a version of the twist Cassegrain antenna radar used successfully in the Sapphire 23ML in the MiG-23, and analog signal processing similar to their earlier designs. This was the N19 radar. The computer controlling it was a digital unit designed by the Argonne OKB and designated TS-100. The N19 radar weighs about 270 kilos. It's a pulse Doppler radar operating the X-band at about 3 centimeter wavelength. It has high PRF radar modes for optimal detection of closing targets, a medium PRF mode for optimal detection of receding targets, and an interleaved high to medium PRF mode for all aspect detection. There's a guard channel for side lobe suppression as well. Semi-active radar homing illumination and the main channels use different frequencies within the X-band and are time multiplexed. Individual aircraft's radars were preset on the ground to different frequencies to avoid mutual interference during group operations. In this implementation, the N19 scanned a cone plus or minus 70 degrees in azimuth and minus 45 to plus 60 degrees in elevation. The 32 kilogram TS-100 processor is capable of 170,000 operations a second. It has 8K of RAM and 136K of ROM. It's based on a proprietary POISK architecture developed at Argonne, and it was very efficient in terms of instruction processing and code compactness. Apparently, the overhead for processing instructions was about twice as efficient as the Argonne 15 in the MiG-31, and the code was between 3 and 5 times more compact. The TS-100 was therefore cheaper to make. To give you a point of comparison, the F-14's 5400B computer was the best of the first models of the Teen series. It weighed 68 kilos, but it could perform 550,000 operations a second. Operations per kilogram were therefore 8,100 in the F-14's 5400B, which first flew in the early 1970s, versus 5,300 operations per kilogram in the TS-100, which first flew in the early 1980s. It was a good computer for the Soviet Union, and probably the last time at which their semiconductor industry was able to get even close to that in the West. As a system, the MiG-29 could detect a fighter-sized target at 50 to 70 kilometers and track it at between 40 and 60. That's about 43 miles for detection and 37 for tracking if you're in old money. The Soviets used a MiG-21 as their reference target fighter, and the radar could detect targets 32,000 feet above the aircraft and 18,000 below it, traveling between 140 and 1,500 miles an hour. The full beans version of the system that was available to Soviet pilots had a free search mode that made use of its superior electronic countermeasures capability. Exactly what this did or does isn't entirely clear to me, though, I'm afraid. The high PRF mode, sometimes described as the encounter mode in Soviet literature, was used for the first stage of the intercept, sometimes guided by GCI data link. Having detected enemies, up to 10 targets could be tracked simultaneously in the medium PRF mode. Of these, the computer would automatically calculate a firing solution for the one that it judged most dangerous. I assume this was a function of distance, direction, and speed. The radar could then switch to a targeting mode that enabled the guidance of a semi-active radar homing missile, a process that took 4 seconds. Interestingly, the tracking mode could only discern targets if they had 4 kilometers of separation, which seems like a significant limitation. Function over marshy ground and forest was impaired as the radar was particularly sensitive to false returns of this kind of terrain. The final point on pursuit mode is that it could be used to direct the Erst and vice versa, allowing targets to be held onto even if they were using electronic countermeasures. Both pursuit and encounter modes could be set to automatic, which allowed the TS-100 to use a combination of high and medium PRF radar modes to detect and track targets, rather than waiting for the pilot to designate them for tracking. Once in close, the pilot could select dogfight mode, which fixed the radar into a 2.5-second scan pattern directly ahead. When the computer determined that there was a target in that domain, the pilot could select it with one press. The IRST also has this semi-automatic target acquisition capability. Protecting against counter-detection, the original MiG-29 had an SPO-15LM or Serena 3 radar warning system. This system held 6 preset memory cards for each mission. They'd be swapped depending on what was expected to be encountered. Delays in development meant that until 1986, Fulcrums had no active ECM system. Avionics setup was the main way in which export versions differed from the core model. Export version A was intended for Warsaw Pact countries, and it had the slightly downgraded N19EA radar that lacked the best available ECCM modes. There was also export version B, intended for general export and supplied to Hungary, India, Iraq, and Syria, amongst others. These had the further downgraded N19EB and a less capable TS100-0206 processor that was less able to automatically track targets. Typical armament consisted of 4 R-73 Archer infrared homing dogfight missiles, 2 R-27 Alamo medium-range missiles, and an internal twin-barreled 30mm cannon with 150 rounds in the starboard wing group below the cockpit. Nominally, the MiG-29's primary armament was the R-27, known to NATO as the Alamo. It was available as a semi-active radar homing missile or with an IR seeker cooled with liquid nitrogen supplied by the pylon. Range was up to 35 miles in the radar version and 30 in the infrared. Both carried an 86-pound warhead. The R-27 was a good weapon, more or less equivalent to the AIM-7M Sparrow. There was also a long-body, extended range version of the R-27 available. This could be carried by the MiG-29 and it was compatible with its fire control system, but was not really all that much use in the 1980s given the capabilities of the MiG-29's radar. All MiG-29s could also carry the R-23 and R-24 Apex from the MiG-23, although this was a much less capable weapon. Besides reduced accuracy and resistance to countermeasures, range was only 15 miles. Export version B was originally supplied with these missiles, much to the disappointment of the Iraqis in 1991. As the fight closed in, the R-73 became the main weapon. R-73, or Archer to NATO, is a rightly well-regarded weapon. In combination with the Schmel 4UM head-mounted sight, it allowed for missile shots up to 45 degrees off the nose. The R-73 in this early form could track up to 120 degrees off bore sight and track a target pulling up to 12G. It achieved this through a control system that combined aerodynamic fins with a reaction control system. The sensor also allowed for all-aspect shooting at short ranges. It did have 2 weaknesses, though. First was range, which was only 5 miles, mainly due to the performance of the sensor. Second was warhead effectiveness, which proved less impressive than the 17.6-pound continuous rod warhead would suggest. Even so, in a dogfight situation, it was probably the best air-to-air missile in the world in the 1980s. Again, export version B initially carried only the R-60 Aphid, which was incompatible with helmet-mounted sights and it had a range of only a couple of miles. As a last resort, the GSH-301 cannon was a brutal weapon. Whereas the contemporary M61 Vulcan was electrically smooth, the 30mm went off like, well, a cannon, right next to the pilot's ear. It caused significant noise and vibration as well as a huge flash. On the plus side, the 30mm rounds were devastatingly powerful. The gun sight was slightly hard to interpret but was usable. It used a laser rangefinder cued by the IRST to track a target and generate a firing solution. Although in expert hands it was highly effective, gun barrels had a short life and they were expensive, so it was not regularly fired in training. On the original version of the Fulcrum, the gun could not be fired with the center tank in place as the shell cases were ejected down that line and could puncture it. This was corrected with a new ejector port on the post-1986 upgrade. And since we've just got there, In 1986, the original Fulcrum tactical fighter was replaced on the production line by the Hunchback version with an additional 240 litres or 600 pounds of fuel capacity in the fuselage upper fuel tank and wing pylons plumbed for drop tanks. The actual pylon for the 800-litre drops was heavier than the usual missile pylon, and it was usually left attached to the tank on the ground. Fitting it meant removing the usual Alamo pylon, though. The 1986 and after aircraft are obvious from the longer spine behind the cockpit. This version also introduced the L203B ECM suite into the Fulcrum for the first time. Its aerials are located under 4 dielectric panels in the wingtips. This system had taken a great deal of time to develop, hence the absence of ECM from the early aircraft. The Soviets didn't differentiate the new version from the original, but NATO designated it Fulcrum C. Although tactical range was increased, the difference without the ferry tanks was minimal, a matter of a few more minutes of flight time. I don't believe that any Cold War MiG-29s have in-flight refueling capability, although an add-on kit was produced in the 1990s. A fighter bomber version was mooted in period, but it never saw production prior to the fall of communism, and it thus falls outside the scope of the channel. Likewise, the upgraded Fulcrum M and the carrier-capable Fulcrum K. As promised, there was also a MiG-29UB Fulcrum B two-seat trainer. This was combat-capable and also highly maneuverable. However, it lacks the fire control radar and thus can only use IR missiles, including the R-27M. While the single-seater was stable and trustworthy, the different airflow over the nose made the UB a tricky aircraft to fly. All in all, around 1,200 MiG-29 single-seaters and 200 UBs were constructed before 1991. Around 800 of these were stationed in Eastern Europe, either with the Soviet Air Force itself or with the Warsaw Pact. The remainder were stationed to guard the southern flank of the European Soviet Union. The Fulcrum wasn't used in the Asian part of Soviet territory until right at the end of the 1980s because of its limited range. During the 1980s, the relatively large numbers of Fulcrums relative to flankers made it the main threat aircraft for NATO forces and pilots. Looking at it as a cold, technical observer, it looks like a mighty threat indeed. But when assessing the combat effectiveness of the MiG-29, it's always important to remember who it was built for. By the 1980s, the average NATO pilot flew upwards of 180 hours a year, including realistic exercises and dissimilar air combat tactics and practice. On the opposite side of the Iron Curtain, the average Soviet or Warsaw Pact pilot typically got only 60 to 70 hours. There have also been attempts to reframe the Soviet pilot as a more independent thinker in recent times. That may have been true in certain elite units, but the historical record seems quite clear about the fact that MiG-29 pilots were trained for tight GCI control, and they spent comparatively little time on training to fight their jets independently. They were trained to make high-speed slashing attacks and not to turn back and engage in a turning fight. This was particularly stark when Germany unified. Within a few years, only a handful of East German pilots remained in MiG-29s, skill and flexibility being major reasons for their leaving service. That and some of them being informers for the Stasi. Cockpit ergonomics and avionics features were amongst the ways in which the MiG-29 was optimized for use by this type of pilot and maintenance crew. Because it has neutral stability, the Fulcrum is also a forgiving aircraft. It's very difficult to induce a spin, and if one is entered, simply releasing pressure on the stick causes the aircraft to recover. That control stick is large compared to that in a Western fighter, and it requires a high degree of deflection to maneuver the aircraft. The pilot really needs to throw the stick around in a close fight. Control forces are heavy compared to a Western fighter, but not relative to earlier Soviet times. They do have a lot of damping in them, though, which transmits back to the pilot via the stick. The Fulcrum thus always feels like something's moving around a little, even in level flight. Taking off is made simple by the MiG's excess power. Lining up on the runway using the nose wheel control on the second throttle, the pilot holds the aircraft on the brakes and then applies full power. This noticeably depresses the nose gear's oleo strut. Takeoffs can be made with or without afterburner. The nose wheel steering requires some pilot inputs to keep the nose straight over the first 50 or 60 kilometers an hour, after which the aircraft settles into the right track. At 125 miles an hour, the pilot gives a sharp tug on the stick and the nose lifts. It flies off at just over 140. As the aircraft rotates, the protective screens in the inlets retract, causing a sudden aerodynamic shift that dips the nose. The pilot therefore needs to be ready with the trim button on the stick to compensate. Once airborne, the pilot can then enjoy what's arguably the ultimate expression of a pre-digital fighter. Although instantaneous turn rate is best in class and sustained turn rate is also excellent, one weakness of the package is the roll rate, which is slow at 160 degrees per second in normal conditions. At low speeds, that falls to just 20 degrees a second. Introduce high angles of attack and the rudder inputs reverse, so that applying right rudder rolls the aircraft to the left and vice versa. Incidentally, early Western experiences with the MiG-29 suggested that roll rate was much more impressive. After a flight taken by analyst Benjamin Lambeth in a UB in 1989, he reported that roll rate was 360 degrees a second. Later pilots flying the single-seater in Germany reported that more limited roll rate, though. Perhaps it's a difference between the single-seat and the two-seater, or to do with comparing a clean and a dirty aircraft. In any case, I take the view that the extensive experience of the operational pilots in Germany gives the more accurate picture. On the plus side, the Fulcrum is able to maintain controlled flight at much lower speeds than contemporary US fighters like the F-16 and the F-18. Only the F-14 could continue to maneuver at the sub-150 knot speeds at which the MiG-29, with its combination of lightweight, high power and high lift, could sustain. Outside of close fighting, the MiG-29 was simple to operate, but it did require the pilot to be heads down and to have plenty of practice to set the aircraft up properly. The procedure called for moving left to right across the cockpit, starting with the missile select button on the left throttle, then moving to the controls on the lower left cockpit console. As the IRST was used second in any engagement, the radar missile controls came first. If engaging in practice, then there was a switch marked Friend that enabled the systems to lock onto a friendly aircraft based on returns from the IFF. Next, the pilot needed to check that the missile's fuses are set to the air position. Most Soviet missiles had a secondary air-to-ground mode that deactivated the proximity fuse. Then the pilot selects radar mode on the forward left part of the instrument panel. Usually a radar mode would be selected, but the radar itself would be left in the standby mode, in which it was fully warmed up but not radiating. Master arm was located on the upper right part of the main panel, alongside the weapons control system switch, which would be set to radar so that the Alamo could be fired when a lock was achieved. The numerical code for the missile would appear in the lower right corner of the HUD to indicate which weapon was selected. That switch also allowed the helmet sight to be selected to cue archers at close range. In a close fight, pilots were taught to fly with the missile control trigger on the control stick depressed. That way, if either the helmet-mounted sight or the IRST obtained a lock-on, a missile would be instantly fired. Those milliseconds could make all the difference in a dogfight. The final stop on the journey was to activate the SPO-15 radar warning receiver in the right corner of the instrument panel. Rings of green, yellow, and red threat lights surrounded a stylized aircraft, indicating the bearing, power, and type of any radar scanning the MiG. Once GCI indicated that he was in position, the pilot would flip the radar from standby to illuminate. A swarm of parallel lines would appear on the HUD for some seconds as the computer sorted the contacts and selected the real targets. The cursor would then settle on the target that the computer judged to be the most easy to attack. The radar lock button was on the throttle. Clicking it sent data on the target's course and speed to the Alamo. When the self-test was complete, the scratchy female voice synthesizer would announce that launch was approved. Pressing the missile trigger would fire the weapons. Salvos of 2 were the standard, both to increase probability of kill and because carrying just one of the heavy Alamos would unbalance the aircraft and limit angle of attack to only 15 degrees. Although they were obviously trained for beyond visual range engagements, generally speaking, the Fulcrum pilot's objective would be to get into position to merge with a Western tactical fighter and use its close-range missiles. It was outgunned by essentially all of its adversaries from beyond visual range. This wasn't a missile problem, as the R-27 was comparable to the contemporary Sparrow, although it was equally unreliable. It also wasn't a radar problem, as the N-19 wasn't far off the performance of the Hornet's AN APG-65. The problem was in the human-machine interface. Because the Fulcrum was designed for GCI intercepts and less well-trained crews, the pilot's abilities to use the radar for situational awareness were sorely limited. This would have been manageable when working in numbers with Soviet ground control, but it has proved a crippling problem with operating the MiG-29 when it's being flown by inexperienced pilots in small numbers and without proper support. If the Fulcrum is able to get within 5 miles, then it is a very dangerous opponent. As the pilot closed in, he would switch the sensor control knob from radar to close combat infrared. The Erst dome would now track a target, providing imagery in the HUD. The pilot was now ready to engage, and he could use the Fulcrum's outstanding performance feature in visual range combat. Having worked out its quirks in testing, pilots soon realized that the MiG-29 could maintain very high angles of attack. The alpha limit is 26 degrees, but this is a soft limiter and pilots can push through it. In the Western inventory, only the Hornet could match the Fulcrum in this respect. What the Fulcrum had, which the Hornet did not, was outstanding thrust to weight. Close-range combat against a Fulcrum is therefore like fighting a Hornet on steroids. It has the FA-18's alpha married to the F-16's thrust-to-weight ratio. The Fulcrum can go over the top at 150 knots, whereas the same move would require 250 in the F-16. As it happens, the Viper and the Fulcrum actually have the same angle of attack limiter, but the F-16's limit is a hard one. The MiG-29 could go to 35 to 40 degrees. The MiG-29 also has no G limiter, which means that the pilot has to be a bit careful, as the aircraft can easily do a 12G turn. That would definitely bend something. Pilots would apparently adjust the environmental controls on the way into combat to provide as much oxygen as possible to allow them to maximize their personal G limit. Although the MiG-29 has a slightly better instantaneous turn rate than the F-16, the Viper's sustained turn rate was better. To win against a Viper, the MiG-29 pilot needed to get the Viper pilot slow if he could. In close, there wasn't all that much in it, and remember that in the 1980s, the Fulcrum had the helmet-mounted sight and the Archer combination, whereas the F-16 had the good but much more limited AIM-9L. Whatever the nature of the enemy and the task at hand, all Fulcrum missions were short. Its tactical combat radius was just 150 miles, assuming 2 minutes on station in Afterburner. For ferrying, there was the 2 underwing tank option on the post-1986 version. The uncomfortable seat would make long-endurance missions unpleasant, whatever range-extending flight profile was being used. When they got to their destination or back to base, landing was predictably easy, though. The tough landing gear was forgiving of less than smooth touchdowns, and there was a clover-shaped braking parachute to slow the aircraft. If landing at night, there was a small spotlight on the front landing gear struck to illuminate the runway, and a much larger one on the right side main gear door. For all of its combat potential and the concern it caused in NATO, the MiG-29 has been a pretty unsuccessful air-to-air fighter. Unless there have been some undisclosed Fulcrum kills in Ukraine, the type has thus far only scored 2 kills, and those were a pair of Cessna 337 Skymasters shot down by a Cuban UB 2-seater using R-60 aphids. In return, at least 11 Fulcrums have been shot down by other fighters, 5 over Iraq and 6 over Serbia. These aircraft aren't really representative, as they were the export version B aircraft and flying against overwhelming odds. They do, however, demonstrate the issue of using an aircraft designed to be part of an integrated system on its own. Since the Phantom, NATO has essentially defined its air-to-air fighters as either multi-role or air superiority. Because the MiG-29 is 4th generation, because of how it looks, and because of its reputation, we automatically assume that it too is a Western-style air superiority fighter. But it isn't. Its closest analogue in terms of role is probably something like an English Electric Lightning. Outside of the supporting network of GCI, surface-to-air missiles, and heavier Su-27s, its vulnerabilities are magnified and it is unable to deploy its strengths. Fights with F-15s and F-16s have been decided beyond visual range with Sparrows and AMRAAMs. The other telling statistic about the MiG-29 is its production rate. Whereas the USSR was able to make over 5,000 MiG-23s and over 10,000 MiG-21s, it only managed 1,400 or so Fulcrums. In the same period, the US churned out 1,500 F-16s. For the first time, NATO was outproducing the USSR in aircraft, remembering, of course, that it was also producing F-15s, F-14s, and F-A-18s. The Fulcrum was good, but it was at best on par with its adversaries across the Iron Curtain, and it was now outnumbered. What we can't do, however, is dismiss the Fulcrum in and of itself. It had some unsophisticated features, particularly in the areas of quality control and its human-machine interface. But it also had capabilities that were distinctly superior to Western aircraft within the envelope it was designed to operate. Most obviously, its combination of Erst and head-mounted sight. So we should be in no doubt that had the balloon gone up in the 1980s, the Fulcrum would have proved a deadly enemy to NATO aircraft.